I moved to Manchester in the autumn, chasing the promise of a new beginning. The city was a sprawling maze of red brick terraces and grey skies, unfamiliar but oddly comforting. I rented a small flat on the second floor of a converted house, nestled on a quiet street. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. Unpacking became my routine, filling shelves with books and hanging cheap art on the walls to make the place feel less temporary. My life started to settle into a rhythm, and for a while I managed to convince myself the past was behind me. The mornings were spent at my new job, evenings walking the quiet streets, wrapped up in the solitude I'd come to appreciate. Then one evening I saw him. He was standing across the street when I came home from work, leaning against a lamppost, his arms crossed. The sight of him sent a jolt through me like cold water poured over my head. It was the last face I'd wanted to see, the one I'd worked so hard to escape. He didn't make any move towards me, didn't shout or wave, just stood there waiting. I locked the door behind me and stayed by the window, peeking out between the curtains. He was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, a trick of my mind, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. Over the next few days, the feeling grew stronger. I'd catch glimpses of someone in the distance, a shadowy figure that always seemed to be just out of focus. A car idling too long on the corner, footsteps behind me on the pavement that never matched mine. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, but it was hard to ignore the prickle of unease that came with every glance over my shoulder. The flowers arrived on a Friday. A knock at the door startled me, and when I opened it, there was no one there, just a bouquet of bright red roses sitting on the doormat. The card tucked inside had no signature, but I didn't need one. The handwriting was his, looping and aggressive. I threw them in the bin, my hands trembling. After that, the calls started. Late at night, just as I was beginning to relax, the phone would ring. When I answered, there was silence. It wasn't the static kind of silence you hear when no one is there, but the kind that felt alive, breathing on the other end. I blocked the number, but they kept coming, always from a different one. I stopped answering and let them ring out, but the sound filled the flat, echoing through the small rooms until it felt like the walls were closing in. I started sleeping with the lights on, locking the door twice before bed, even though I knew it wouldn't stop him if he decided to push further. The thought of him standing outside so close made my skin crawl. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, every creak of the floorboards. Then came the night I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the side of the mattress. I crept into the hallway, every step feeling like it echoed too loudly in the silence. The flat was dark except for the soft glow from the streetlights outside. I moved towards the living room where the sound had come from. The window was shattered, glass glittering on the floor. A gust of wind rustled the curtains, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just a random act of vandalism. But then I saw the boot prints on the floor, tracking through the glass and into the room. I froze. Gripping the bat so tightly, my knuckles ached. The prints led towards the kitchen, disappearing into the darkened doorway. My chest tightened as I stepped forward, the bat raised. The flat felt wrong, invaded, like I was no longer alone. The kitchen was empty, but the back door stood open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I locked it, bolted it, and checked every corner of the flat before calling the police. They arrived quickly, walking through the flat with torches, their voices low as they examined the window. They told me they didn't find anyone, but to stay alert and let them know if anything else happened. I spent the next day cleaning up the glass and trying to convince myself it was over. But when I came home from work, there was another note waiting for me. This one taped to the inside of the front door. It was only one word, scrawled in the same looping handwriting, mine. I packed a bag that night and drove to a hotel, the thought of staying in the flat unbearable. The police said they'd keep an eye on the place, but I knew it wouldn't stop him. He'd always been relentless, and now he'd found me again. We'd been away for a week. But it wasn't a long holiday, just a trip to Devon to get some sea air and escape the grind. The drive back felt longer than the journey there, as it always does. The kids were restless in the back seat, and my wife was already listing off everything that needed doing. Unpacking, laundry, groceries. It wasn't until we pulled into the driveway that I noticed something was off. The curtains in the front room were closed. We'd left them open. I knew because my wife always made a point of it. Open curtains gave the illusion someone was home. That was what she'd said when she tugged them apart before we left. Sunlight spilling over the carpet. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot, and stood there for a moment, staring at the house. It was our house. Red brick, small garden, the gnome by the door my daughter insisted on buying, but it felt different. I put it down to being away too long and carried on, pulling the bags from the boot as my wife herded the kids towards the door. When we got inside, the smell hit me first. It wasn't strong, but it was there, a faint, stale odor, like damp mixed with sweat. I paused in the hallway, looking around. The shoes by the door were out of place, shifted from where we'd left them. The coat rack had a jacket on it I didn't recognize, faded green with fraying cuffs. My wife was already heading to the kitchen, chatting over her shoulder about dinner plans, oblivious. The living room was worse. The sofa cushions were dented, an empty mug sat on the coffee table, and the TV remote wasn't where it should have been. My daughter pointed at the mug and laughed, asking if we'd left a ghost to house sit. My stomach tightened as I stared at it. The tea stains were fresh. The kids ran upstairs to check their rooms, their laughter echoing down the hall. My wife started unpacking in the kitchen, oblivious to the dread pooling in my gut. I didn't want to scare them, didn't want to sound paranoid, so I stayed quiet. But I checked every room on the ground floor, opening cupboards, looking under tables, even glancing behind the curtains. Nothing. The upstairs, though, was worse. The kids' beds had been slept in, the duvets twisted and rumpled. My son's closet door was slightly ajar, a pair of unfamiliar shoes sitting neatly inside. My daughter's desk had papers scattered across it, drawings she hadn't made, crude sketches of faces with wide, empty eyes. I didn't tell my wife about the shoes or the drawings. Instead, I locked all the doors and windows and called the police. They came quickly. 2 officers who walked through the house with the casual detachment of people who'd seen it all before. They told us it was probably a squatter, someone who'd found the place empty and decided to take advantage. They didn't find anyone, of course. The intruder was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of stale air and the marks of their presence. The officers told us to keep the doors locked and call them if anything else happened. Then they left, as if that would be enough to make us feel safe. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes set my teeth on edge. My wife slept next to me, oblivious, while I stared at the ceiling, listening. The house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt borrowed, used, like something that had been touched too many times by unfamiliar hands. The next morning I found something that hadn't been there the day before. A note scrawled on the back of an old receipt and left on the kitchen counter. It said simply, the handwriting was jagged, the letters uneven, as if whoever wrote it was shaking. I didn't tell my wife. She was already jumpy, flinching at the smallest sounds. I didn't want to add to it. Instead, I doubled down on checking the locks, making sure every window was shut tight before bed. But it didn't help. The next few days were worse. Little things kept happening. Food went missing from the fridge. The kids' toys were moved, arranged in strange patterns on the floor. My son swore he'd left his tablet on his desk, but we found it in the loft, buried under a pile of old blankets. The smell lingered too, stronger now, like sweat and unwashed clothes. Then came the night I woke up to footsteps. They weren't loud, just a soft creak of the floorboards in the hall outside our bedroom. I froze, my heart hammering, listening as they moved towards the stairs. I slipped out of bed, grabbing the cricket bat I'd stashed under the bed, and crept to the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. The loft hatch was slightly open. I didn't go up. I couldn't. Instead, I locked the bedroom door and sat in the dark until morning, the bat clutched in my hands. When the sun came up, I went to the loft. It was empty, of course, but the smell was stronger there, and in the dust on the floor I saw footprints, bare with long, narrow toes. We left that day, packed up the kids, grabbed whatever we could fit in the car, and drove to my in-laws. My wife didn't ask questions, just nodded when I said we needed to go. I didn't tell her about the loft or the note or the smell that wouldn't leave my nose. It was a quiet afternoon when I began to notice the first of the little things. I was sitting in my dorm room, hunched over my laptop, trying to finish a paper for class. I was just getting to the end of the second paragraph when I noticed the corner of my curtain move, as if something had brushed past it. At first, I thought it was the wind. The windows were cracked open and it wasn't exactly warm that day, so the breeze seemed a reasonable explanation. But then I caught it again, a shift in the curtain, not caused by the wind this time. I stood up, walked over to the window and peeked out. Nothing, just the usual view of the campus quad, with people walking between buildings, chatting, some sitting on the grass. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. I'd been distracted lately, stressing over finals, over everything. I went back to my desk, but that odd feeling didn't go away. The next day it happened again. The movement of the curtain, a soft, almost imperceptible flutter. But this time, when I went to the window, I thought I saw a figure in the distance. He was walking away quickly, almost too quickly for someone just strolling across campus. I knew that walk. It was Matt, my ex. Matt had been overbearing, obsessive. We'd been together for almost a year, but I'd ended it a month ago. I couldn't handle it anymore. The constant checking in, the way he'd show up uninvited, always demanding my time, my attention. He didn't take it well. I'd asked him to leave me alone, but Matt wasn't the sort of person who accepted rejection. At least, not easily. I tried not to think about it. I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe it was someone else who just happened to walk like him. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I stopped opening the window just in case, but that wasn't the end of it. The following week, I came back to my dorm after class to find the door slightly ajar, not wide open, but enough for me to notice. I hadn't left it like that. My heart jumped in my chest. I stepped inside carefully, looking around, checking for anything out of place. Nothing seemed disturbed. My bed was where I left it. My books were still piled on the desk. But then I found the note. It was on my pillow, folded neatly, as if someone had taken their time. My stomach twisted as I unfolded it. The handwriting was Matt's. "I miss you. Come back to me." It was short, simple. But the fear settled in deep, and I couldn't shake the thought that he'd been in here, that he'd come in while I was gone. I locked the door after that, double-checked the windows. I even pushed the dresser in front of the door, as if that would stop him. The next few days were a blur. I barely left my dorm, and I spent every second of free time with my friends, hoping that would keep me safe, that they would keep me safe. But it didn't work. Matt kept appearing. He would be outside the window at night, standing still, not moving, just waiting. One evening I had enough. I called my best friend Lucy and asked her to stay with me. She agreed, of course, but when she arrived, she seemed a little too calm, as if she didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. She sat on my bed, flicking through her phone, telling me not to worry so much, that everything would be fine. But the night didn't feel fine. As we were sitting there chatting about nothing, I noticed the faint sound of scratching. It was coming from the door, soft, almost like something or someone was trying to slide something under it. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid, especially not with Lucy sitting there. But when the scratching stopped, I saw it. The handle on the door moved, just a fraction. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, texted Lucy to stay quiet, and called campus security. They said they'd be there soon, but the seconds stretched, felt like hours. The handle twisted again, harder this time, and the door gave way. Matt stood there in the frame, his eyes wild, like something had snapped inside him. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed the door shut as hard as I could and locked it. He banged on the door, shouting things I couldn't make out. Lucy was frozen on the bed, staring at the door, her face pale. I didn't want to leave her alone, but I knew I couldn't stay in there with him outside. We grabbed our things and moved to the window. I barely managed to open it wide enough to crawl through, and we climbed out onto the fire escape. I had no idea where Matt had gone. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I knew he was still out there, waiting for me. We spent the night at Lucy's place. The next day, campus security went to my room to check for any signs of forced entry. They didn't find anything, no broken locks, no signs of tampering. But they told me to stay cautious, to report anything suspicious. They said they'd increase patrols in the area. But that didn't stop me from feeling his presence, lurking just beyond my reach. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face I saw on campus made my stomach tighten. I don't know when the last time I was truly alone was. I don't know where Matt is now, or if he's still watching me. I lock the doors, I check the windows, but something tells me that's not enough. There are nights I still hear scratching at the door, and I wonder, will I be able to stop him next time? To stop him? The house was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. It wasn't just the absence of my parents or the hum of conversation from the TV in the background. It was the stillness of a place that had always felt alive. I kept busy at first, pacing between the kitchen and the living room, scrolling on my phone, trying to convince myself I was fine. It was just one night. They'd gone out of town for a wedding and I'd begged to stay behind. I could handle being alone. It wasn't even late when the knock came. I froze, the sound cutting through the stillness of the house. It was firm and measured, like someone knew exactly how much force to use to get attention. I wasn't expecting anyone. My parents would have called if they'd forgotten something or arranged for someone to check in on me. I stayed where I was for a moment, unsure what to do. Then, as quietly as I could, I moved towards the front door. I stopped a few feet away, peeking through the narrow gap between the curtains. A man stood on the porch. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his hair damp as though he'd been caught in the drizzle that had swept through earlier. He knocked again, louder this time. My stomach twisted. I hadn't turned on the porch light, and he didn't have much detail to his face in the dimness outside. I wasn't about to open the door, not without knowing who he was. My parents had always drilled that into me. He leaned closer to the door, saying something I couldn't hear through the thick wood. Then he tried the handle. I felt the blood drain from my face as it rattled against the lock. He pulled at it, testing it, as if he was deciding whether to push harder. Then, after a pause, he stepped back. I crept away from the window, my heart hammering. My phone was in the living room, but I didn't want to move from the spot. It was like I thought he might hear me even though he was outside. A long stretch of silence followed, and I hoped, he might have given up. Then the sound of glass breaking filled the house. It wasn't loud, just sharp enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I didn't know where it had come from, but it wasn't the front door. I ran to the kitchen, my socks sliding on the linoleum as I skidded to a stop. The small window above the sink had been shattered, the jagged edges glinting in the dim light. A wrench maybe, lay on the counter beneath it. Panic kicked in. My hands shook as I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a bread knife from the block by the stove. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The house felt too big, too open, with too many ways for him to get in. Footsteps echoed from somewhere in the house. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. My phone was still in the living room, and I cursed myself for not keeping it with me. I needed to get out, to run to a neighbor's house or call for help, but he was in here now. He'd be faster than me. The footsteps came closer, uneven, like he was limping. I held my breath, barely daring to move. Then the sound stopped. It was like he'd frozen, listening for me. I backed away from the wall, keeping my eyes on the doorway. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Then I spotted the back door, just a few feet away. I edged towards it, my free hand fumbling for the lock. I didn't dare look behind me. It took a second longer than I wanted, but I got the door open. The cool night air hit me as I stumbled out into the garden. I didn't stop, didn't think, I just ran. The grass was wet underfoot, the faint glow of the streetlights up ahead guiding me. I didn't look back, not even when I thought I heard something behind me. I reached the neighbor's house and hammered on the door, my breath coming in gasps. They let me in, their faces pale as I tried to explain what had happened. I didn't make much sense, the words tumbling out in a rush, but they called the police. When they arrived, the house was empty. They didn't find him. Just the broken window and a trail of muddy footprints leading from the kitchen to the back door. My knife was still on the counter where I'd left it, untouched. The officers stayed for a while, walking through the house, checking the locks, asking questions I didn't have answers for. They couldn't tell me who he was or why he targeted me. They just reassured me it was probably a random break-in and left, promising to patrol the area more often. I stayed with the neighbors that night. I couldn't bring myself to go back into the house, not even when the sun came up. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It's been a few days since then. My parents are back now, but they don't understand why I won't stay there alone. I don't tell them about the way the man moved like he'd been in the house before, or the faint smell of cigarettes in the air, the same brand my dad used to smoke. I don't tell them about the missing spare key from the hook in the hallway. The one I hadn't noticed was gone until the next morning. I don't tell them about the man I saw standing at the end of the garden last night, just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching. It began with a text message. Nothing alarming on its own, just an address. My address. No name, no explanation, no number I recognized. I stared at my phone for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, someone typing a wrong number. People make mistakes, but there was something about seeing my address there, spelled out so plainly, that made my skin crawl. I deleted the message and locked my phone. That was 3 nights ago. My son Ollie was already asleep upstairs. I'd just finished cleaning up the kitchen, the TV murmuring softly in the living room. It was an ordinary evening, or it should have been, but every so often I'd glance at my phone as though another message might pop up. Nothing did. The next morning I forgot about it. Life carried on, work, school runs, meals, bedtime. I was used to keeping things together. It had been just me and Ollie for a while now, and we'd found our routine. I didn't have time to dwell on strange messages from unknown numbers. Besides, it didn't seem worth worrying about, not yet. 2 nights later, another message arrived. This one wasn't text. It was a photograph. My house again, taken from outside. It wasn't far away, just across the street from the angle of it. The windows were lit up, the curtains drawn, but I could see the faint glow of the living room lamp bleeding through the fabric. I was in there when the picture was taken, probably sitting on the sofa oblivious. I didn't delete this one. I stared at it, my stomach tightening as the seconds stretched on. It felt like the air in the room had shifted, like I wasn't alone anymore. But when I looked out the window, the street was empty. Just cars parked neatly along the curb, bins lined up for collection, houses dark and silent. I thought about calling the police. I picked up the phone twice, but didn't press the buttons. What would I say? Someone sent me a photo of my house? It sounded paranoid, stupid even. So I locked the doors, checked the windows, and double-checked Ollie was still asleep in his room. Then I stayed up all night staring at my phone. The next day, I kept the curtains closed. I told Ollie it was to keep the heat in. He didn't question it, just went back to building his Lego towers. I made myself busy, laundry, dishes, clearing out the junk drawer in the kitchen, anything to stop thinking about the messages. That evening, another photo came through. This one was closer. The angle was tighter, more personal. It was a shot of my front door, the mat I'd bought from the garden centre last summer, the chipped paint around the letterbox. I could see my own reflection faintly in the glass, distorted by the curve of the frame. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. I left the phone on the kitchen counter and went to check the locks again, though I already knew they were secure. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to listen for anything unusual. I don't know what I expected, a footstep on the path maybe, or the sound of the gate creaking open, but there was nothing. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with a kitchen knife on the counter beside me, the phone within reach. Every so often I'd pick it up, check the messages, scroll through them again as though that they might make sense if I looked long enough. But they didn't. By the next morning I was running on adrenaline. My nerves were frayed, every sound in the house setting my teeth on edge. Ollie didn't seem to notice, but I could feel it building, that awful electric tension that hummed through the house like static. I didn't tell him why I was jumpy. He was just a kid. He didn't need to know. The break-in happened that night. I was in the living room again, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying not to think about the messages. The curtains were closed, the locks checked, the lights on. I told myself everything was secure, but I felt it before it happened, this sharp prickle on the back of my neck like being caught in a storm. The sound of glass shattering came from the kitchen. I froze. It was only for a second, but it felt like an eternity. Then I was moving, grabbing the knife I'd left on the coffee table, darting to the stairs. I didn't even check the kitchen. I just ran to Ollie's room, locking the door behind me. I could hear him moving downstairs, heavy footsteps, things being shifted and overturned. My heart was hammering so loud I thought he might hear it. I didn't need to see him to know who it was. The messages, the photographs, it had been him all along, my ex, out of prison, angry, looking for a way to punish me for leaving. I held Ollie close, whispering to him to stay quiet. He didn't cry, didn't make a sound. Brave little thing. The footsteps came up the stairs, deliberate and measured. He stopped, outside the door, the handle rattling as he tried it. Then came the sound of something scraping against the wood, a thin metallic screech that set my teeth on edge. The door held, but only just. I gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles ached, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it didn't. Instead, there was silence. I didn't know if he'd left or if he was still there, waiting on the other side. When the police arrived, the house was empty. They didn't find him. Just the broken glass in the kitchen and the mess he'd left behind. I didn't tell them about the messages. I didn't think it would make a difference. That was 3 nights ago. I keep the curtains closed now, the locks checked, the phone by my side at all times. But every night when the lights are off and Ollie's asleep, I sit in the dark and listen. I don't know what I'm waiting for, but I know it's not over. Not yet. It was a quiet life, at least until I noticed the car. A silver hatchback with a dent on the passenger door, parked down the road from my flat. It wasn't unusual for people to park on the street. There weren't enough spaces for everyone's cars in our little neighborhood, but this one didn't belong. I didn't see it every day, just often enough to catch my attention. The first time I really noticed it, I thought maybe someone was visiting. It wasn't a bad area, but people still kept their curtains drawn and minded their own business. Nobody was going to start asking questions about a parked car. Still, I started keeping track. Over a couple of weeks, I saw it twice outside my flat. Once outside the cafe I stopped at for breakfast, and again near my office. I told myself it wasn't the same car. It couldn't be. Then I saw him. He was sitting behind the wheel, hands resting on the top of the steering wheel. From where I stood on the pavement, I couldn't see much. Just the outline of his face, the line of his jaw. But it was him. I hadn't seen Mark in years, not since the fight. He looked different, older, maybe leaner, but it was definitely my brother. I didn't approach the car. I didn't even look at him too long in case he noticed me. Instead, I went back inside and sat in my kitchen, staring at the blank wall across from me, trying to think about what to do. The last time I'd seen Mark, he'd been shouting at me, calling me every name under the sun, accusing me of ruining his life. And maybe I had in a way. I didn't mean to. I thought I was helping, but things spiraled out of control. Money, debts, bad decisions, it all piled up, and Mark blamed me for every bit of it. After that, I moved out of town. I tried to start fresh. I didn't leave any contact details behind, didn't answer when mutual acquaintances asked where I'd gone. I didn't think he'd care enough to look for me, but there he was. The next day, the car was gone. I didn't see it again for weeks, but that didn't stop me from looking. Every time I went out, I checked the street, scanned the cars parked at the curb, searched for that familiar dent on the door. When I didn't see it, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it wasn't Mark. Maybe it was just someone who looked like him. Then my flat was broken into. It wasn't a smash and grab job. Nothing big was taken, no electronics, no money. It was little things. A photograph of me and Mark as kids, the pair of us grinning on the beach, a set of old keys I kept in a drawer but never used. The lock on the front door hadn't been forced. Whoever did it had a key or knew how to open it. The police came and filled out a report, but nothing ever came of it. They called it random. I knew better. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up in the dark, listening to every sound outside, every creak of the floorboards. I tried to tell myself that if it was Mark, he wouldn't hurt me. He was angry, but he wasn't dangerous. At least I didn't think he was. Weeks passed, and I didn't see him again. I stopped checking the street, stopped thinking about the break-in. Life went back to normal, or as close to normal as it could. Then, one evening, I came home to find an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. There was no message, just a photocopy of an old receipt with my signature on it. I recognized it straight away. It was from the loan we'd taken out together, the one that had sunk Mark's business and left me struggling to get out from under the debt. That night, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. If Mark wanted to confront me, fine. I'd face him. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows. I didn't have an address for him, but I knew where he used to live. A little terraced house on the edge of town. It wasn't hard to find. His car was parked out front, the same silver hatchback with the dented door. I sat outside for a long time, watching the lights in the windows. They flickered now and then, like someone was moving from room to room. I waited until it was dark, until the lights went out. Breaking in was easier than I thought it would be. I used a screwdriver to pop the latch on the back door, just like I'd seen in a video once. The house was silent as I stepped inside, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. I didn't know what I was looking for, what I expected to find. I just wanted something, anything, to explain why he'd come after me. The living room was small, cluttered with old furniture and magazines. On the walls were photographs, family pictures, holidays, Christmases. There was one of us as kids sitting on Mum's lap. I turned away from it, my eyes falling on the coffee table. There was a handgun lying there, its polished metal catching the moonlight coming through the window. I froze, staring at the gun. I'd known Mark was a collector. He'd always been fascinated by them, but seeing it there, so close, made my skin crawl. I backed away, my foot catching on the edge of the rug. There was a soft sound behind me, a shift in the air, and I turned just in time to see a shadow move across the doorway. There wasn't time to think. There was only the deafening crack of a gunshot, the flash of light in the darkness, and the sharp sting of pain in my leg as I fell. The world spun as I hit the floor, my hands scrabbling against the wood. I tried to crawl, but the footsteps came closer, deliberate and steady, stopping just short of where I lay. I didn't dare look up, look. It started with the flowers, not ordinary flowers. These were wilted, greyed things, their petals curling inwards like fists. They had no scent, only a faint dampness that seemed to cling to my hands when I picked them up from the porch. A small card came with them, blank except for a smudge of ink in the corner, as if someone had started to write something but changed their mind. I threw them into the bin. That was 3 weeks after we'd moved into the little house on Heathcroft Lane. The move had been quick, too quick really. When the papers were signed, I packed up what I could fit into the car and we left the rest behind. My son Jamie wasn't happy about it, but he understood. He's a quiet kid, not much for arguments. The town seemed nice enough, bungalows and terraced houses, a park at the end of the street, a corner shop run by a woman with a soft voice and kind eyes. It felt manageable. I needed manageable after everything that had happened with Tony. Tony didn't take the divorce well. That's putting it lightly. There were angry emails, endless voicemails, the threats couched in pleading words. You can't do this to me, to us. When that didn't work, he'd tried showing up at Jamie's school, hanging around the car park like a stray dog. The restraining order wasn't much help, it just made him angrier. That's why we moved. A clean slate, miles away from him, but the flowers were only the start. A week later I found a box on the step. It was small, wrapped in brown paper with no note or address. Inside was a cracked photograph frame. The photo was one of ours, Tony and me at the beach, long before Jamie was born. The glass had been broken and pressed back into the frame so that the jagged edges stuck out in uneven shards. I still don't know how he got it. I thought I'd burned all the pictures. I tried not to think about it. I told myself it could be a coincidence. But coincidences don't come in threes, do they? The next thing was the key. It wasn't my key. It was old and rusty with a twisted loop at the top. I found it wedged into the soil of the potted plant by the front door. Jamie swore he didn't put it there, and I knew he was telling the truth. He'd been spending most of his time in his room, headphones on, escaping into his games, like he always did when things got bad. I buried the key in the garden. That night I woke up to the sound of something creaking. It wasn't the wind, I knew that much. It came from inside the house. Faint but distinct, like the groan of wood under a shifting weight. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each noise. Eventually the silence came back, but I didn't sleep again. The next morning I found the back door unlocked, not wide open, just barely ajar, enough for someone to slip in or out. I checked every window, every door, even the loft, but there was no one there. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been, though. Jamie noticed I was jumpy, but he didn't say anything. He was like that. He'd learned to be quiet when things got strange. The neighbors started acting odd, too. Mrs. Wilkes from next door stopped smiling when we passed her house. The man across the street, Mr. Hartley, used to wave when he saw us, but now he barely looked up. It felt like the whole street was closing in, like we were being squeezed out of a place that had once seemed so welcoming. I didn't know if Tony had anything to do with it, but I couldn't think of anyone else. Then came the footprints. They were muddy, trailing from the back garden to the patio doors. I found them on a cold Tuesday morning, just before Jamie left for school. The police came, but they didn't seem interested. They said it was probably kids messing around, or maybe an animal, though the prints were too big for that. I started locking every door, every window, checking them twice before bed. It didn't help. The last thing was the mirror, a small one, the kind you hang in a hallway. It used to belong to Tony's grandmother. He'd always been oddly possessive of it, never letting me clean it or move it. I found it in the kitchen one morning, leaning against the toaster. I don't know how he got in to leave it there. The locks were all still bolted. Jamie swore he hadn't seen or heard anything, but I could see the fear in his eyes. That night I slept with the lights on. Jamie wanted to sleep in my room, but I told him to stay in his own. I wanted him to feel safe, and for some reason I thought keeping things normal would help. I woke up around 3. The lights in the hall were still on, spilling pale yellow into the room. I lay there, staring at the door, listening. There was a sound, soft and almost gentle, like something brushing against fabric. I couldn't place it, and I didn't want to. My chest was tight, my hands clammy as I gripped the duvet. I didn't get up. I couldn't. The noise faded after a while, leaving behind only silence. When I finally found the courage to move, I crept to Jamie's room and opened the door a crack. He was asleep, the glow from his computer casting faint light across his face. I stood there for a long time, watching him breathe. I don't know what I'll find in the morning, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending it's just in my head. Something's coming, and I don't think I can stop it. It happened on a Wednesday, one of those dull, drizzly afternoons when everything feels half done. I'd popped into the supermarket for milk and bread, barely paying attention to anything except getting home and out of the rain. The car park wasn't busy, but as I was loading the bags into my boot, a man drove up and swung into the spot next to me so fast I thought he might take off my wing mirror. I froze, bags still in hand, staring as his tires squealed against the wet asphalt. He got out and didn't look at me, but there was a sharpness to the way he moved, an energy that made my stomach twist. He was tall, scruffy, his coat hanging loose over his shoulders. I noticed the creases in his clothes and the scuff marks on his trainers, little details that stuck with me. He slammed his door shut, brushed past me on his way to the store, and muttered something under his breath. I didn't react at first, it wasn't worth it. People like that usually weren't, but as he disappeared into the automatic doors, I couldn't stop thinking about it. His presence had rattled me, left a sour taste in my mouth. I shook it off, finished packing the boot, and drove home. The house was quiet when I got back. My wife was working late and the kids were staying at their grandparents' for the night. It was just me, the sound of rain against the windows and the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I put the shopping away and settled onto the sofa, trying to relax, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the car park. The man's face was there, just on the edge of my memory, along with the way he'd moved past me, so close I could feel the cold air he carried with him. I was restless all evening. I checked the locks twice before heading to bed, something I never did. When I finally lay down, I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. The next morning I found something tucked under my windscreen wiper. It was a scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet with words scribbled in jagged handwriting. It wasn't much, just a few sentences, but they were enough to send a chill through me. They described the car I drove, the street I lived on, even the color of my jacket. There was no name, no signature, just the sense that someone had been there, close enough to notice things about me I wouldn't have thought twice about. I looked around the street, hoping to spot someone. Anyone, but it was quiet, just the usual row of parked cars and the sound of a dog barking in the distance. I threw the note away and tried to push it from my mind. But it stayed with me all day, a nagging thought I couldn't shake. By the weekend, I was convinced someone was following me. I'd catch glimpses of a car parked across the road, or feel like someone was watching as I walked to the shop. It was subtle at first, nothing I could pin down, but the feeling grew stronger with every passing day. Then the notes started appearing more often, on the car, in the post, once even slid under the front door. They never said much, just enough to remind me that whoever it was, they knew where I lived. I told myself it was just a prank, some kid messing about. But it didn't feel like that. It felt personal. The details were too specific, the timing too precise. I started locking every door and window the moment I got home, drawing the curtains, double-checking the locks before bed. The worst part was the silence. They never showed themselves, never made a noise, just those notes, and the occasional feeling that someone was out there somewhere watching me. It all came to a head one night. I'd fallen asleep on the sofa, the TV still on, a glass of wine half empty on the table. I woke up to a sound, a soft creak of floorboards from somewhere in the house. My stomach tightened as I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. I grabbed the remote, turned off the TV, and listened. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood, my heart pounding, and moved towards the kitchen. The door was open, the light from the fridge spilling onto the floor. I knew I'd closed it earlier. I reached for the largest knife in the block, gripping it so tightly my hand shook. I moved through the house, checking every room, every corner. The windows were locked, the doors secure, but when I stepped into the hallway, I saw the back door. The lock had been forced, the wood splintered around the frame. I turned and caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A figure darted into the living room, quick and silent. My breath caught as I followed, knife raised. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, but I could feel the presence of someone else, the faint scent of damp and stale smoke lingering in the air. The struggle was brief, chaotic. He lunged at me, and I swung the knife wildly. There was a sharp, panicked grunt, and then he was gone, retreating into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, the knife slick in my hand, my mind racing. The police came later, their torches cutting through the night as they searched the garden and the surrounding streets. They found nothing, no sign of him, no clue where he'd gone. Just a smear of blood on the carpet and the broken lock on the back door. They told me to be careful, to install better locks, maybe even a security system. They didn't say what I already knew, that whoever it was, they weren't finished.